Hello, the centre of the world's economic attention is going to be focused around the Swiss town of Davos over the next few days as the World Economic Forum meets high in the Swiss Alps to look at solutions for global economic problems and also to see how the economy is quite literally changing around us. Let's have a discussion about how that is happening and what solutions could come out of Davos and which are the points to actually watch and which are the speeches to make sure that you don't miss as well. Jonathan, let's start with you. We have a situation where literally everyone who matters is going to be in one place at one time. Some of them are politicians, some of them are financiers, some of them are industrialists. This must talk to how interconnected our world is now.
Yeah, I think in a funny old way, if you look at the co-chairman of the actual conference, you have one from Africa, one from India, one from China, two from the States and two from Europe. So I think, even that reflects the changing dynamic that we have in the world today. So absolutely, it's the world is more interconnected and growing smaller by the day.
Paul, Africa is becoming a bigger part of the global economy. There's a bigger focus on Africa now as well. Just the fact that African nations are invited to the World Economic Forum, I suppose, speaks about how Africa's place in the world economy is changing, and you see that reflected at Davos.
Yes, and I think it's important to say Africa is about 20% of the world's surface, but at the moment makes up only 3.5% of the world's GDP. But if you look back to 2000, it was only 2.7%. So that speaks to the enormous growth that we've seen in Africa, and many people are looking at Africa and looking at the changes and the growth in Africa. And of course, as Jonathan's mentioned, we have a co-lead there. And then we have a special World Economic Forum for Africa specifically, and that will be in May, and those are every year. So Africa certainly is a focus, but it's also a focus when the world is getting together.
Tristan, we talk about growth in Africa. People in Africa are very optimistic. We have quite high growth rates, and yet the World Economic Forum, of course, is going to be focused about the Eurozone as well. There's going to be talk about tapering, the end of the policy of pumping money by the US Fed through the international financial system. These are going to be quite hot issues, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think in particular there's going to be a lot of focus on what tapering of QE, so reducing QE in the States, is going to mean for emerging markets as well. We saw a lot of problems and developments in terms of currencies, in terms of financial markets during the summer around this tapering issue and QE. So that's going to be a hot topic for sure.
Paolo, you focus on the South African issues, of course. Every time someone mentions the word tapering, the rand takes a little bit of a bath. Are you sort of going to be watching this very closely from that aspect? I mean, there are going to be quite a few discussions around Africa that will affect us, but tapering from a South African point of view surely is going to matter.
So tapering definitely from a South African point of view matters. We've seen a net result potentially in the rand weakening as the competitiveness of other currencies comes to the fore, as the US dollar has, for example. I think from a South African perspective, one has to understand that with a weakening rand, you talk of potential inflation problems in South Africa and a consequence on the interest rate cycle. Those, of course, are the negative aspects that tapering may have on the South African rand and the country as a whole.
One of the big discussions, Tristan, is going to be about technology, the way that technology is changing. When you look at how technology is changing economies, I presume that when you look at Davos, there are going to be discussions about whether technology is literally putting people out of jobs.
Yeah, it's a hot topic at the moment now. There's a lot of talk now about some of these, that we can't generate enough jobs, certainly in the Western world, and technology is right at the forefront of that. So there can be some very interesting events and speeches on this subject, for sure.
Do you think that technology is radically changing economies now? We had the cell phone boom in the 90s. That seemed to really increase productivity. Are we seeing a similar sort of boom? Are we seeing similar sort of economic gains from technologies that are coming through now? Or is technology in some places maybe getting a bit of a negative connotation?
Well, there's a wide variety of views on that. There's an economist, Robert Gordon, who's written quite a well-known piece now saying that actually we're not benefiting from technology. The advances now are not as great as having running water and the combustion engine and all these developments we had in previous industrial revolutions. I take a different view. I think if you look at businesses, whether it's retail, whether it's finance, media, technology is radically transforming all of these areas of our lives, and technology is spreading to all corners of the world. So I think this is a very significant development. development, and it should, in time, lead to more productivity and, with stronger demand, lead to better growth as well.
Jonathan, much of this technology has made in China stamped all over it. The Chinese economy is sort of now the world's second biggest. It's somehow almost taken on a mythical status as how important it is. Davos will be watching that really very closely. How important do you see the Chinese economy in the world at the moment? What kind of impact is growth in China and worries about slowing growth in China having on the global scenario?
Yeah, I guess we've got used to the impact in China, as you rightly say, being all the goods are made in China, particularly the low-cost goods. I think we've also come to quite readily realise the impact that China's had on commodity prices. I think perhaps what we haven't realised is what's going on in the financial sector in China and what's happening with regards to that globally. You know, they've got some of the biggest banks in the world now, China, and they're beginning to use some of that financial muscle, so shall we say. So I think, you know, the whole impact of China is growing, and it's growing in areas that we haven't previously thought of.
Paolo, we see in different parts of the world Chinese businesses, Chinese-owned businesses get different political reactions. In a South African point of view, there's a bit of a push to buy South Africa. You know, every time the Springboks run onto the field, someone's checking the label of their shirt to see where the shirt was made. Do you see the South African economy as suffering or gaining from what's happening in China right now?
I think longer term it potentially could gain. I think the question of competitiveness comes to the fore. The South African economy, whilst we can talk of collaboration specifically with the BRICS as such, the South African economy will lack potentially a very strong commodity cycle behind this recovery that we're seeing globally, and therefore its competitiveness as a nation needs to come forward and take place. So longer term, I think the South African economy will move to a more competitive position.
But the last 2 years have seen a lot of discussion of the BRICS, particularly in South Africa. They were expected to be the nations that were really going to grow strongly, pull the rest of the world behind them. We haven't really seen that happen.
No, we haven't. So they're growing below pre-crisis levels. Actually, a lot of that has to do with their ability to finance growth off their own balance sheet. So they're running debt positions which are fairly high at the moment. And so they're caught in a situation now where they are very much reliant on the developed world in terms of that growth and the ability to leverage off that growth for their own growth. So the importance of global growth to those BRIC nations at this point in time is especially important, of course.
Paul, we're the only African nation in BRICS, but the African economy, everywhere you go, someone who travels around the continent a lot, everywhere you go, you start to see countries growing, some of them really quite quickly indeed.
Yes, and we're seeing a lot of infrastructure spend, and I certainly notice it every single time I visit somewhere, and even if it's only 6 months since you've been there, you see something new, a new parking garage at an airport, whatever it might be. So there's significant change. Unfortunately, also the downsides for us who travel a lot is that we end up in a lot of traffic jams and things like that. More and more difficult to book hotel rooms, expensive to travel, but then again, all of those things lead to new opportunities for people to put up new hotels, and all that is happening too. So Africa is a very, very exciting place at the moment.
You could almost be describing, Jonathan, China 20 years ago.
The traffic jams are still there today.
And the pollution, of course. Environmental issues are supposed to be one of the big issues at Davos this year. Jonathan, pollution in China, pollution in Asia more generally is becoming more and more of a political issue, but it's an economic issue as well.
Yeah, there's a huge cost to it. It's an economic issue, it's a health issue, and I think China is very, very concerned about it. And I think what they're doing in China today is very meaningful in a global context.
Paolo, from a South African point of view, there'll be talk about the tapering. There's a big South African delegation going. Pravin Gordhan's going. Abraham Patel's going. What for you do you think? I mean, is there a first prize for you? Is there something you'd like to see come out of Davos that might help South Africa? And I imagine no tapering is not really on the table.
No, tapering is definitely on the table. So I think the first prize is South Africa's ability to cope with a world that is moving from super stimulus growth, transitioning into what is more natural growth, and South Africa's ability to tap into that growth rate in absence of potentially what has always come to our saviour is a commodity cycle which might not be there this time, of course.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.